All right, welcome to Brodhead 2022. How many people is this your first visit here? All right. How many people have made 10 visits here? 15. 20? Okay, you two guys run the club tonight. All right. Here's what I want to talk about. How many people here are building a peat and pole, have a peat and pole, or are pretty serious about deciding the project that you're going to build as a peat and pole? Okay. We're going to cover 4 separate topics here, and I'm going to introduce the 4 topics, and we're going to have a little bit of discussion and a little bit of back and forth and a little bit of input. But we're not going to solve the 4 things that I'm going to bring up tonight. What we're going to do is we're going to introduce them into the dialogue of peat and pole building this year. They're important. They're important topics. And I want them to get discussed and hashed out amongst the group of people who are building. Now, what's different about peat and poles is this. If we go up to Oshkosh and we look at Zeniths, you can meet Sebastian Heinz, the president of the company, who is the son of the designer, and his brothers all work for it, and you can meet their design staff and everything. And if you have any question about how a Zenith is built, they have professionals and engineers to tell you all this stuff. Now, if you have a question about how a peat and pole is built, then it goes to the community. And one of the things that we all know is that you can just go straight to the internet, and anything that's on there is actual, factual, quality information that you can count on, right? We know that to be true, but we can't change that situation, right? And what we have to do is deal with it. And part of the way that we're going to deal with it is drawing people's attention of new builders to concepts that they have to understand when they're sorting through the information about building so that their airplane doesn't get derailed. Okay? So we got 4 things that I want to talk about, and we're going to hit on them a little bit. And in no particular order, I'm going to start with a concept that I don't think many people talk about, but it's something that I kind of wanted to introduce to the conversation, and it's a concept I have called the primary quality of something. Now, you can look at stuff all the time, and you can say, what is the primary quality of a peat and pole? What would you say it is? Why do people? What's great about flying a peat and pole today?
Simple.
If it was, it's an open cockpit airplane. It's a beautiful. It's an open cockpit, beautiful classic airplane. So if somebody came up to you and said, I haven't been to Brodhead, but I'm building a peat and pole as a cabin airplane with an enclosed canopy, and it's going to have tricycle gear, you would say to the guy, you're probably missing what the primary quality of the airplane is. And while that sounds ridiculous, people do this all the time. They do this all the time. Here's an easy example. Get a guy and he says, I'm going to put a Continental or a Lycoming engine on my airplane. And why do people choose Continental? What is a good reason for choosing a Lycoming or a Continental?
A known quantity.
That's not going to help.
We're not using the microphone as part of the PA system. He's just recording it. What is the primary quality of a Lycoming or a Continental? What is it?
Known quantity.
Reliability. All right. So you're sitting there thinking, I'm going to put a Continental or a Lycoming. If somebody came up to you and said, the reason why I'm going to choose a Lycoming or a Continental to install in my aircraft, there might be multiple reasons, like he knows where he can get one or whatever. But the primary thing that makes it a good choice, that would be rational, is it's a reliable engine. All right, one of the most popular engines that we use on Pete and Poles is a 65 Continental. How many people here own a 65 Continental or have flown behind one? Okay, great engine, right? How did a 65 Continental become really, really reliable, known as a reliable engine? Came out in the late 1930s, was installed on certified aircraft. It was maintained, designed by installations designed by engineers. It was maintained to a very high level of professionalism by really good mechanics who really knew their stuff. When people paid mechanics to do good work on airplanes, and those things in their first 10 years, by 1948, even though we had a war stuck in there, by 1948, they were known as incredibly good, reliable engines. Okay? So you're choosing a Continental. Rational choice, right? Okay. Guy chooses a Continental, and he then says, I know what the quality that I want was. I want what those people believed in 1948 after 10 years of observation. So does he say to himself, I am going to replicate what they did that made it reliable. I am going to have quality new parts in it. I'm going to run it in a manner that's appropriate for the factory. I'm going to use certified style props on it. I'm going to do all of the things that gave it the reputation. Now, there's another guy who says, I don't have to rebuild the mags or the carbs on it or anything because this is a certified engine. It's totally reliable. I can feed it any kind of gasoline, put any kind of oil in I want. I don't need to read a manual of that. I don't care whether or not anybody's looked inside the mags of this in 50 years. It's a Continental. It's reliable. So recognize that the primary quality of the engine choice is reliability. Now, does the mindset that the guy have, does he reinforce that by making choices that exemplify and expand on the primary quality? Or does he take the primary quality for granted and then go ahead and squander it? Does he squander it? So you have primary quality where people miss like what's great about the airplane, but then you have the primary quality where some guy takes a part and makes an assumption about it and then take it for granted. If you think about what made 65 Continentals great in 1948, and then we go up to the Oshkosh Fly Mart and there's a 65 Continental in there sitting on a tire in there, what does that engine up there have to do with 65 Continentals as they were operated and maintained in 1948? And the answer is nothing. Nothing. So to get the primary quality out of something, to utilize the primary quality instead of squandering it, you have to not take it for granted. You have to work with the primary quality. So does this concept make sense to people? How many times have you seen things that you thought that would be a fun flying day VFR airplane, and you meet some guy who's building it, and his version of it, he says, I've got an entire vacuum instrument panel on this because I'm going to fly it in hard IFR. So there's a guy who took the primary quality of a simple airplane and decided he was going to do something inappropriate with it. So whenever you look at stuff, conversely, go out there and look at the successful airplanes that were out there, and somebody looked at the primary quality of the airframe and of the engine choice that they were trying to do and all of this stuff, and they were making choices that emphasized the primary quality rather than go against it. If you think about it that way, when you watch choices that people make, whenever I talk about Pete and Poles to people, you'll occasionally get somebody who says, oh, Pete and Poles, that's the cheap airplane for those real budget home builders and stuff like that. And I've had guys say that to me who were senior airline pilots who obviously made a ton of money. And then you said to them, you have demonstrated to me that even though you have the resources to be, take advantage of the primary quality of your aircraft as it was built, you do not, So if you look at stuff, there's the mistaken belief that primary quality is about money or anything. The thing is, you got to understand what the primary quality of it is, and then you have to work to maximize it. And quite often the difference is learning, not spending money. All right. Okay. Next thing I wanted to touch on. How many people, when you read the stuff on the internet about how to build any part, watch the discussions for stuff like tail wheels, and you can bring up the concept of, I'm going to put a tail wheel on my Pete and Pole, and here starts the contest of who can make the cheapest tail wheel, right? Have we seen this before? How many people go on there and say, I'm going to put a Matco, a Scott, or some other tail wheel on my airplane, ACS tail wheel, or any of these other tail wheels that are going on other home builds all the time? There's some reinforcements you want to do on the back of a wood fuselage for that. That's understood and everything. But a lot of people choose regular tail wheels like Scott's or ACS tail wheels, and they're money. They're $200 or so, and people put them on airplanes, and that's great. But in the land of Pete and Poles, there's a certain subgroup of people, right, who start off. And some of these guys are very clever. Now, I'm not knocking who these guys are. You got to listen to the full story, right? There'll be some guy who says, I thought about it, and I went on Amazon and I bought a shopping cart wheel, and I'm going to build a tail wheel out of a shopping cart wheel, right? Have we not seen something like this? What happens in 10 minutes? It's followed up by another guy who said, oh, well, I went to a yard sale and I found a shopping cart wheel for 50 cents, and I'm going to use that one because I'm not into wasting money on Amazon, right? Have we not seen this, right? And then within a day comes the guy who says, I got a shopping cart wheel and I stole it from a homeless guy in my town by hacksawing it off his shopping cart, and I stole his aluminum can collection and recycled it, so I'm ahead of you guys, right? So there's this, in Pete and Poles, there's this sub-genre of people who are in a contest to build the least expensive aircraft, right? Now, how many people on my website have seen a guy who builds three-wheel carts, my sidekick in Florida, Vern Stevenson? How many people have met him in person, all right? Vern Stevenson, I would put against anybody for building something completely inexpensive. I am friends with the king of doing this. Vern has 4 ultralights at his place, and the really expensive one has about $3,000 in parts in it. So he can build stuff like this, and it works out. So I have no doubt that the right person can actually build stuff this way. That's not in question. There are very, very clever people out there. Here's where the problem comes with this. How often do we read about new people starting a Pete and Pole who love the idea, and they have a budget that does not hardly include the price of the plans initially? And they want to know how much money the first thing they want to know about the Pete and Pole isn't how safe can I make this fly, how much can I learn while I'm building it. They don't have questions like this. The first question is, how cheap can I build it? This is not an alien idea. We've seen this before. And there's nothing wrong with having a budget for an airplane, right? Here's the discrepancy where it's important, right? I can take Vern Stevenson and he could make that shopping cart wheel He doesn't steal things from homeless people, but it just looks that way. And he could make that shopping cart wheel perform perfectly. He's a master welder, but when he was 15 years old, he got into the mechanical world and has been there ever since. He's 70 years old. He's a phenomenally good welder. Worked for NAS Jacksonville, for the Navy for years in shipyards. He also can operate like any vehicle you can think of. There are famous ultralight stories of Vern experimenting with different types of fabric and losing 4 square feet off the middle of a wing on a piece of fabric and landing the airplane and then saying, it wasn't really that bad. I think I could fly it around the field just at low altitude one more time to check it out. So, give you an idea of like how he can handle almost any motor vehicle in the world. He is the only person that borrows my pickup truck because most other people look at it and think, that looks dangerous. But to Vern, it's just merely understanding that not all the brakes work and you need a little lead time, and it's going to pull one way at partial brake pressure and it's going to pull the other way at the other one. So he can operate stuff. And there are plenty of people who can do this, right? Problem is, the guy who wants to build the really cheap airplane, and he asks about this, and he's going to follow the shopping cart wheel crusade, right? Except he doesn't have any of the skill set. He also, if something isn't really right about it, and it handles kind of funny, and the tail wheel is at the wrong caster angle, and you can go back and, Vern would go back and fix that, right? Some guy who doesn't really have the flying skill set, right? First, his weld would break because he doesn't know how to weld shopping cart wheels. You got to use coat hangers. Vern would tell you that in a second, but so the guy who doesn't have the background and the skill set trying to imitate and compete with people who do have that background and skill set. The guy who's the new arrival, who's listening to a discussion about how cheap you can build things, doesn't recognize that the old hats at this, the guys like Vern, have entirely different skill sets, from scrounging stuff all the way through how you operate it. So how many people, per year arrive and in the world of Pete and Poles, get online, read some stuff about it, and then only later find out that they built stuff that really isn't safe for them to operate, or they worked on stuff that they shouldn't have been working on. Okay, so when you watch something like this, what do these guys have in common with the master scroungers? The only thing that they have in common, and this is the whole moral of this little piece, the only thing they have in common with the master scroungers are that they're cheap, right? And being cheap only works if you're really skilled, right? But guys who are really cheap don't want to believe that they don't really have the skills or they can't imitate the masters at this. So a lot of guys who arrive looking for cheap, who are told, yes, you can do it like this, their projects get derailed by that. Okay. Can you personally think of an example like this where you've seen somebody barking up the wrong tree? Or have we ever arrived somewhere? Can any of you think of it when you arrived in this and you didn't realize how much you were going to learn by building the airplane quite yet? Or you thought it was going to be cheaper? Think about that. Okay. Let's touch base with the third topic. Mistakes that sink a project. All right. Let's say how many people here are working on their very first airplane that they've ever built? Okay. You're working on the first home built that you've got. You basically, to start off with a phrase that can't really be overused, is you don't know what you don't know. All right. And you arrive, and one of the things that you don't want to have to learn is that something you chose to do, right, 5 years from today makes your project worthless. I have in my hangar half a Pete and pole fuselage. A guy built it in the 1970s. Fantastic woodwork, fantastic welding. Looks great in every way, shape, and form. I inherited this. It's sitting there, and I had Earl Brown and Kevin Porti at my place, and they looked at it, and you could take a plastic scraper, you know, that looks like a regular metal scraper, but just a plastic one, and you could go around and you could pop gussets off the airplane. The glue in this, I believe, was aerolite, and I don't know that it was mixed correctly. It's kind of a finicky glue, and there are even people who suggest that that it's an outdated concept. Now, if I said that online, you're going to have a zillion guys defend aerolite to the death, and they're not going to listen to the point, right? They'd say, I've built 25 home builds, and I've used aerolite on all of them. That's great. You're the 25 home built guy. What we're talking about is the first time builder who just got the airplane and he's getting it together. He shouldn't be using stuff that only works for some of the people sometimes. Where you really don't want to make a decision like that is with the glue that you use on it. Because you can't go back and fix that. Truthfully, the problem will be that if you make a mistake like this, let's forget the glue. What about if you chose the wrong wood? What if you chose the wrong wood? And you later on find out that only after you glued up the entire fuselage and went down to the hardware store, only afterwards somebody told you what a compression failure in a piece of wood was. How many people know how Bernard Pete and Pole tested wood for compression failures?
Hard way.
Do you know how he tested them?
Back in 1929, there weren't too many known tests.
Here's a test that he used all the way into the 1970s. If you have a long stick of wood and you stand there and whip it and it has a compression failure in it, it will give out at the compression failure instead of bend uniformly. So you take it and like you're fly fishing with it, even if it's a longeron, you can watch this and you can turn it around the other way. I've been and visited people's projects who I said, I'm going to do this with your longeron that you got and you made it out of lumber from your local store. And the guy said, well, I don't think you need to do that. And my question was, what are you afraid of if you're so sure of it? And I've actually done this and done the lightest sway like this back and forth with one and had it pop. And you could take a look at it, and where that tree was felled or where that log was rolled over and handled, it had a compression blow to it. And they're hard to see, and they're hard to test for, really reliably test for. Again, we're talking about Bernard being able to hold a piece of wood in his hands and whip it like a fly pole and reliably judge whether or not it has a compression failure in it. He can do this. Do you think you can describe that well enough over the internet to people? No. First time builders? I don't think you can. Well enough to say that it's a reliable test that you would be substituting wood based on that. So if you were a new guy arriving and you picked the wrong wood or you didn't know what a compression failure was until your fuselage was together, you would have effectively sunk your project. The other thing is, how many people do we know who've started a project and found out that they made a very large mistake? The primary thing isn't the money wasted or the time wasted, it's the enthusiasm. People don't have what it takes to come back fighting a second time. It's reality. It's depressing. Very, very few people have the substance of character to say, I just got my ass kicked by this. And you know whose fault it was? Mine. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to regroup on this and I'm going to make better choices next time. Does that sound like an average story these days? Or does it sound like, I evaluated the Pete and Pole and it's got a divergent stick phugoid oscillation in the second harmonic, and I really have to say I'm going to have to build a better airplane. Oh, So you used Aerolite glue, did you? You know, so if you're a new guy, right, stack the deck in your favor, right? Stack the deck in your favor and do what successful people have always done. What's an example of a glue that works for virtually everyone? T88. T88 works, period. However, I mentioned that on the internet, and there was some guy who wrote in a long diatribe explaining that T88 is the most criminal product on earth, and he has all the evidence to say that it never works, and he's always using Gorilla Glue because it's a much better bond to wood, and he knows this. And by the way, the moon landings were faked. You know, JFK shot himself, and reality TV really is real. And so you can find one naysayer or two. That doesn't matter, right? What you have to do is realize that there are certain things that everybody has done that has worked, and you want to do those things also. How many people have looked at using something other than spruce spar blanks in their airplane? Okay, I don't consider that a bad idea. I've actually seen guys do very effective jobs using aluminum spar blanks. I've seen this work, I know that it does, and it's great. But it was Kevin Pertee when we were looking at this with a friend of ours, and Kevin Pertee said, call up Aircraft Spruce and find out that each spar blank is $500. And it was like 400 at the time, and they had it, and it was $400. And he said, our mutual friend who we're talking to earns $300,000 a year. Why is he having a problem buying $1,600 worth of wood? And I thought, wow, that's a unique way to look at it. Not that everybody has that kind of financial resources, but what the resource that not everybody has is you don't have the enthusiasm to come back after a major mistake. Some people don't have the skill set to be operating and doing something unique and different. It will always take more time. So if you look at it correctly and say, I have, there are plenty of other spar choices you could do, but you got to pick your battles if you're a new guy, right? And nobody is ever going to have to go rebuild their wings because they ordered spruce spar blanks. Nobody is ever going to have to go back and rebuild their fuselage because they glued it together with T88. So there are choices that people make. If somebody came up to me and said, I've never covered an airplane before, and I'm going to use the Stitz polyfiber system because I've never covered an airplane before. And some other guy says, I've got a methodology to cover the airplane that nobody's ever heard of before, and I'm going to cover it in mercerized ham fat or whatever it is, and I'm going to do that. Who do you think stands the possibility of having to scrap their entire project or go backwards? The only thing that a guy choosing T88, spruce spar blanks, or anything else known like Stitz, the only thing he can possibly be wasting is money. And maybe we can argue that he's not wasting money, right? What he's not doing is he's not wasting time. He's not wasting his one shot at home building. So in the discussion of how cheap can things be done, you could decide later on, hey, I was in the tail wheel game and I decided that I don't want a shopping cart tail wheel. I'm going to call up Aircraft Spruce and get an ACS tail wheel, or I'm going to call up the Sonics people and put on one of their tail wheels, or I'm going to use one of those others, or I'm going to go find a Scott from somebody selling one out at the Fly Mart, and I'm going to put that on, right? You can change your mind about tail wheels, right? Notice that, right? You can't change your mind about wood glue. It's very hard to change your mind about fabric covering, all of these primary things. Yet you'll watch people who are new and doing their first project, they're not picking their battle very wisely. You follow that? And closely in there are welded fittings. Watch people who do a lot of welding on their airplane. They spend the time on it, and afterwards you think, this person needed to share one photograph with people who know what welding looks like to understand that this isn't airworthy, right? So if you're new, don't operate in isolation, and also be willing to take a little bit of criticism from people who are knowledgeable and understanding about these things. I had a guy come to my hangar and brought a Bearhawk LSA fuselage. How many people are familiar with this airplane? Do you know what the tubing kit for that airplane costs? The pre-cut tubing kit? $5,000. He had the airplane all welded up, and he spent 400 hours welding it up, right? He spent 400 hours welding it up, and it took me about 40 minutes to cut it into little pieces. The welds were not salvageable. They were oxyacetylene welds. Anything wrong with oxyacetylene welds? Nope. Okay. He built this airplane in Alabama. They have a tech counselor who came to his place and looked at it and said his welds were okay, right? I don't know who the tech counselor was, but that tech counselor gave off a really poor piece of information. The error he made was he had the two regulators, and I gas welded a lot of aircraft parts in my life, and TIG welded them, and all kinds of welding. He had the two welders set, and I said, what was the oxygen pressure you used? If you have 5 psi on the acetylene, what's the appropriate psi on the oxygen? Okay. If you were cutting, what would you set the oxygen to? 20. All right. The only mistake he made was, while he was trying to weld the fuselage together, he had the oxygen set as if it was on a cutting torch. He had it at 20 psi, had the acetylene at 5 psi. The welds were so oxidized, they were absolutely porous and brittle on 4130. Now, that guy's a friend of mine, and he actually went back and bought another tubing kit and did it the right way. I've actually seen a Bearhawk LSA flying that had welds as bad as his, that he said, oh, they're plenty strong, you know? So don't mess around with stuff like that. Now, that's a whole fuselage on an airplane, but if you think about the welded parts on Peyton poles, right, you really don't want to redo them twice. Now, one other thing to bring up in terms of information on Peyton poles, I went and did an inspection on a guy's airplane about 20 years ago on a Peyton pole that was at Winter Haven, Florida, and the guy had worked on it for about, I'm going to say 15 years, right? And he bought a set of plans, but he didn't buy them from the family, right? He bought the plans, and they were a beautiful little set of blueprints, but they were the same ones in the 29 Flying and Glider Manual. What's the structural mistake that's in the 29 Flying and Glider Manual? Does anybody know what it is?
The truss by landing gear.
Okay, online you can buy copies of the 29 plans from anybody because they weren't copyrighted, right? So that's why people can sell those things, right? However, there's a serious structural mistake in the 29 plans. Lift strut comes up at an angle, goes to the spar. The fitting on the spar has to line up with the lift strut for it to have any strength. Everybody's airplane built that way? You go back and look at the Flying and Glider Manual, and that fitting that should inside bolted to the spar that should be lined up exactly with the lift strut is turned vertical like this.
Same way on Pete Paul's plan.
On some of them. Okay. That fitting needs to be in line. Yes. The fitting needs to be in line. You can look at any other aircraft that has wood spars with that's always in line with it. I went and looked at a guy's airplane's ready to fly, and went there. It's perfectly covered. It's totally painted. And I said, you're not going to want to hear this, but you really need to change that. And he said, well, how much difference could it make? And I said, yeah, just life and death. I actually was curious about it, and one of the best structural engineers I ever knew in my life was Joe Martin, was best structures guy at Embry-Riddle when I went to school there. And I went back to Joe Martin and showed it to him. And he said, oh, yeah, what's the gross weight on the airplane? I said, well, it's technically 1150, but a lot of people fly it up towards 1320. And he said, at 1320, it would, if the spar blank was less than perfect, it would probably pop at about 2.75 to 3 Gs. And I said the other way, you can look at the other way, it'll take 6 Gs without any problem. So you catch people who didn't get, they thought, oh, I can buy the plans online without going to the family, and I could save myself $30. All right? You know, think about uncovering the wings, sliding the ribs off, and then you got to think that the holes that are drilled in the spar are through, not the centroid, but they're drilled through the vertically. What are you going to do with those holes now that are in the spar blank? So I'd love to be able to tell you that guy did the right thing and fixed that, but what he did was he sold the airplane to somebody else. So you don't want to be short of piece of information and then come up with something like that, because that would be a full-scale problem there. So here, let's go on to one other topic that's going to be a little bit different here. And this may seem to be in conflict with some of the stuff I've said before. What people need to do when they're building their airplane is actually build their own airplane. What do I mean by build their own airplane? Here's an easy example. If you said, I am going to go buy an engine for a Peyton pole, if we went online and you said, I'm going to go buy an engine for my Peyton pole, and the engine's $25,000, the one I want to use. It's a brand new 0200 from Continental, an 0200D. I looked at it. They have a show special at Oshkosh. It's 25 grand. I'm going to put that on my airplane. If you said that online, what would the response be? What would people say?
Will you adopt me?
Will you adopt me? Yeah. There would be this giant cry of like, you're spending too much money. Oh my God, you're ruining Peyton poles, you know? And very funny that would draw more negative response than somebody who said, I just stole my shopping cart wheel from a homeless guy, right? So it's very odd that there's this ethic where the loudest part of the ethic is you should build it as cheaply as possible, right? Whether you have the skill set or not. But if you want to build it and it's, you know, you want to build it and you have a particular taste and it makes sense to you to build it and spend your own resources on this, very funny that it will elicit a negative response from a lot of people. Now, when I encounter this with people, I frequently have to remind them, you know, we live in Western civilization, right? You know, like, let me go back to fundamentals. Since 2,500 years, we live in Western civilization. One of the cornerstones of Western civilization that you seem to have forgotten is the concept of privately owned property is sort of unique to Western civilization. There's a few times where we forgot this, called the Bolshevik Revolution, and a few other times. Didn't really work out for a lot of people, but basically private property, you know, is an okay concept. And if some guy owns the stuff and the resources to build his airplane, he's not actually required to follow the group ethic of what he should build or not. So, that sounds funny to say, but I think that how many people have been in the EAA 25 years? Okay, 25 years ago, it was a lot less acceptable to have people say, he shouldn't have done that. That just wasn't part of that's wrong. I don't know where it came from, but it didn't used to be. It didn't used to be part of the whole lexicon of home building. People understood that home building is an individual experience. It's a personal choice of how you're going to spend your time and money, and it's your airplane. So, if you want to, something that I really want to emphasize is that Pete and Poles have this giant panorama of guys from shopping cart wheel guy through guy who wants to put brand new O200 on there. Chances are your project fits somewhere in here, right? You could, if your project has 3 separate guys who are out there who have flying airplanes who say, that makes sense, your choice, right? You're probably on the right path, right? You're probably on the right path. But the trick is you have to build the airplane that you want, right? You have to, if it's your first build, go with things that won't sink the ship, right? But if you want to build your own airplane, you're much better off building the airplane you want. If you build the airplane that the guys on the internet think you should, what's the dirty little trick? If you end up building the airplane that they tell you should build, what do we know? They'll change their mind and they'll tell you did it wrong anyway, right? You shouldn't have listened to them, right? And here's an odd thing that's safe to say here. My booth at Oshkosh is a whopping, actually I think it partially adjoins the RV crowd there, Richard Van Grunsven's group. How many people in this room own an RV? So I know who isn't going to send me a Christmas card after I say this. Right? Anybody own an RV-12 or an RV-6? The airplanes are great. They succeed for a reason. But here, let me tell you something. Every one of us has a local EAA chapter, and you have people in it who are second-hand RV owners, right? They didn't want to build it. They just wanted to own one. What's the primary reason why they chose that airplane? What do you think about it? What do you think was a big, maybe not the primary reason. What do you think about was a big factor in the choice?
Speed, performance.
How about this? Let's go back to slightly more fundamental. I believe, after knowing plenty of great people who own them, I believe that there was an element that they were afraid to be criticized for the choice they would make. It was a form of peer pressure, and they could have looked at plenty of other performance airplanes, but what they wanted to do was be able to go back to the EAA chapter and have everybody say, Bob, RV-7A, greatest light airplane ever made. Good choice. They were afraid of ridicule for choosing the airplane that they wanted to build. And if that sounds ridiculous, stick it in your head, go back to an EAA meeting and watch some of these guys, particularly the second owners of this. And you'd think, oh, well, these guys, they're really successful pilots from various walks of life, and they bought this airplane. If you look at it, a lot of them, it was very, very important to them that their decision, what they built, wouldn't be criticized by the group. All right? Now think about that. Now what they do and the pressure they're subjected to, that's their business. However, we live in the same society, and that pressure that is subconsciously around us, where you think, I'd kind of like to do this, but I understand that there'll be a negative response on this from other people. You have to recognize when that's actually driving your decisions. I'm not going to waste my time going over and giving this speech to people who chose RVs, because That's their conformist mentality, and you're really not going to get beyond that. But here, where you have a peat pole and you can build it any way you want, right? Between these two giant wide bookends, you have examples to follow, good quality examples to follow from one end to the other, where you can do this by proven methodologies with proven techniques and proven components. You can build the airplane any way you want to, but watch very carefully for the RV mentality of conformity coming into your decision making about any choice that you're going to make when you're building your aircraft. Now notice this is very different than a senior peat and pole guy who's been around and built a lot of planes saying to you, really don't use that methodology to glue the parts together, don't use that methodology to weld, or whatever it is. That's good quality advice. But when you catch the people being like, I don't know, I wouldn't do that, you can't let that affect your choices, because in the end, we know that will never make them happy. It stands almost no chance of making you happy, right? Comparison to running your own show, right? So that's an important point that people miss. And I watch this stuff, and when you ask somebody, what did you want to build originally? And you ask them about it, they'll come back and say, well, I kind of wanted to build it like this, but nobody else was doing that except for one or two guys. And you say, the one or two guys who have like 500 hours on their aircraft, those were the two guys you should follow. If the herd said that wasn't a good idea, that's the people who spent a lot of time criticizing other people. All right. So in that 4 topics that we have, building the airplane that you want to own within the range of acceptable, not making a choice about materials or processes that will paint you into a corner and sabotage your airplane. The other point was about not assuming that you have skills to build the least expensive airplane. Some of those people have lifetime of skills. It's not what everybody generally can do, right? I'm a fascinating speaker, I am, all right? But, so if you keep that in mind, your build should go a lot better. But watch the discussion on these things. The discussion in the world of peat and poles, I read this stuff. How many people are on the Peat and Pole Facebook group and read this? Okay. You ever seen anything on there that caused you to question? Just the people who have not built and flown their own first airplane yet. You ever see anything on there that made you scratch your head and think, that can't really be good advice? Right? Yeah, like, let me assure you that those of us who have built a number of airplanes who take a look at that, I look at it and think, I can't start my day by looking at all of this stuff. And sometimes I think, wow, my anger management training that I paid good money for doesn't seem to work at all sometimes. You know, I'm going to go get a refund on that, right? So I try not to respond to some of that, and when I see something like that seems like a tremendously bad piece of advice, I really only have one tactic to make myself feel better. Is I pick up the telephone and I call Kevin Pertee, who has like less tolerance than I do. I'd be like, did you take a look this morning? And I don't know what kind of schadenfreude lives inside me, but I love doing that to him, and he really hates it. So, and when I see he's calling, I never answer the phone. So just okay. I wanted to have a general topic where we were talking about peat and poles in general and important stuff. If there's anybody, I'm going to hang out here for dinner, and then I'm going to head up to Oshkosh, where we have the booth all week with all the stuff on display. If you're one of the Corvair guys who was coming here, or you had a question about the Corvair, we can continue this sitting over in the pavilion or talk about it. But I have we have some manuals and some stuff here, and I'll be glad to share Corvair talk with you. But as I'm here at Brodhead, one of the things I wanted to do is have something of value and experience to share with all builders, not just Corvair builders. So if you got Corvair questions, we'll be here another couple of hours. I'll be glad to cover them. If you got parts for me to inspect, I'll tour the parking lot. If you want to meet some of the other guys who flew in here, Corvair powered airplanes, please stand up.
I'm stuck on the chair.
Shad Bell, round of applause. All right. How many people have met Shad's dad, Gary? Okay. What I like best about your airplane is that your dad started it and flew it, you fly it, and you fly your kids in it. And I think that's just fantastic. It's a 600-hour airplane now, thereabouts?
Yeah.
Okay. And in the category of other aircraft, people who are going to build a Pete and Pole in the future but just happen to have a Zenith right now, we have Fred flew in. Round of applause. Fred's aircraft is the Zenith 750 Stoll that's blue and white out there, and he actually competed in the Arkansas Stoll contest, did a lot of stuff. So if you're looking to meet people who have primary first-hand experience with Corvairs, these two guys would be two guys to talk to who both have their aircraft here. Is there any question that anybody would like to cover?
This structural area.
Or let's answer this gentleman first.
Yeah, this goes back, I think you were here in 2019.
I was.
And you kind of were holding court out there on a red Pete.
Pontificating?
Oh, yeah.
Me?
I got it on
What are you talking about?
I got it on video. Anyway, it was
Captain Humble?
yeah. Very interesting. And it was about the diagonal being welded to the cabane.
Yes.
And you have many good reasons for that. My specific question is, what thickness on that diagonal, and can you TIG weld it to the cabane without taking your wing apart,
Okay.
making a change from half-inch tubing
Yeah.
to a welded diagonal in some fashion without having to take it all apart?
In the weight and balance manual, I cover cabane struts also, and the size that you should be looking at is going to sound colossal, but it takes a gigantic load in a simple accident. Pete and Pole is an enormously strong aircraft. What's the one weak feature of a Pete and Pole is how the fuselage is attached to the wing, right? So if you had an accident, and fortunately most people here have not seen one, but there have been ones over the years where people landed, wiped the gear off, the fuselage stops, except the wing with the fuel in it weighs about 200 pounds, and it parallelograms forward. The only thing that stops it are those two diagonal tubes. Those two diagonal tubes do a fantastic job until that moment. And at that moment, you really want them not to allow the wing to parallelogram forward. The appropriate size is 7/8 049 wall tubing. Now, if you need those welded on, a guy with a TIG welder, you cannot gas weld it. I'm an excellent gas. I have so many things I'm not good at. I obviously know nothing about fashion. My friends will tell you that, like, I'm hopeless when learning taxes. Nobody eats food that I cook. You know, we could just go down the entire list. All right, but I can weld. And I'm going to tell you that you cannot do a quality gas weld on there. I would not. However, I believe that a skilled guy with a TIG welder with wet towels wrapped around an awful lot of stuff could pull that off without too much trouble.
Any specific material?
4130 to 4130, and you're going to weld it up with ER70 rod. That's what most people would use. As an alternative, you can fixture it very tightly on there and get it on there. The one reason why people don't want to do welded cabanes on the diagonal coming down is that guys say, well, I won't be able to move the wing back and forth. and I will be able to move the wing back and forth if I have two threaded rod ends that have 1/2 inch of thread on them, right? I've got news for you. The average guy who didn't plan his weight and balance needs to move the wing like 3 inches. The threaded rod ends aren't going to help you at all on that, right? So if the weight and balance could be fixed, you know, it would be a wonderful world if the weight and balance could be fixed by tweaking the rod end 4 times and putting the bolt back in. It's not enough range of motion on that, right? So it's not really, when you get it in the right place, welding the cabane on. And you can also, if you wanted to, carefully pull the cabane out and slide it back in. The bolts are set in an angle where that can be done. Next question.
Yeah, the structural deficiency you talked about earlier.
Yes.
Can you see that on an airplane, or is that covered up?
It's covered. Can't see it.
William, back on the cabanes, what about the aluminum ones?
On aluminum cabanes, really the thing to do on that is to make a gusset plate on each side. And I would look at a gusset plate that was like 80 thousandths of an inch thick, you know? And any methodology of like, if it was that big on each side of the gussets, I wouldn't put bolts in it, because if you put bolts in it, you're gonna squeeze the tubing down. But if you go to Oshkosh, you can look at like structural pulled rivets, like Cherry Q rivets in stainless steel, and you can use a strong pneumatic puller or a compound leverage puller, and you could pull those down. And if you put 20 rivets in each plate, it would do its job.
You mentioned earlier that the diagonal strut should be welded at the top. You didn't address how it should be connected to the frame at the bottom.
The diagonal strut I'm talking about is the cabane on the fuselage that runs from the top motor mount up to the center section.
Yes.
So that's the diagonal cabane. Earlier, when I was speaking about the lift strut coming up to the aircraft, I was talking about the fitting on the spar. I don't know which one you're specifically speaking of.
Where it bolts the engine
lap.
out.
Where you have the brace that keeps the wing from moving forward.
That's the diagonal cabane strut.
I think he's talking about where the bolt goes through the engine mount at the bottom end of that diagonal.
Okay.
So you have it welded at the top.
And bolted at the bottom.
Thank you.
Yeah. They in structural terms, they call that the degree of fixity on it. And if you look at structural manuals, they talk about a welded fitting with no give in it is a first class, and then second class is a bolted fitting where it has 2 ears on either side where you're clamping it down. You will get darn near the full effect if you can bolt it at the bottom and have it welded at the top. That's acceptable, but what you don't want to do is have it neck down with like a little threaded rod section in there with a jam nut on it where the threads are like 5/16 of an inch, because that's where the cooked spaghetti bends when you don't want it to. So if you have a 7/8 tube, right, coming down that's welded at the top and it comes down to the bottom, a 7/8 tube should fit between the 2 ears on the top of the motor mount, and you can have an insert in there and you can have a bolt going straight through that. Therefore, the entire diagonal would have a minimum cross section of 7/8 of an inch in diameter. And you can see how that would be vastly better than having a neck down threaded section for a dubious adjustment that probably doesn't have the range that you need to fix anything on weight and balance. Any other questions that we can think of?
What about on lift struts if you want to make your own? Is 4130 like 1 inch 049 wall tubing, then with the fairing on the back?
I've made a bunch of sets of lift struts for guys with Pete and poles, right? How many people here own a Tailorcraft or know about the Tailorcraft lift strut, AD? All right. There were about 4,000 Tailorcrafts made. There are about 2,000 left on the register, and about 15 years ago, for the sake that we're being recorded, clean language, a human being of dubious intelligence got an AD against the lift struts on Taylor crafts. And every Taylor craft essentially had to have the lift struts replaced. A Taylor craft lift strut is very close in size. It's not like a Piper, which has a very big front one. Very close in size to the desired size for a Pete pole. It's way shorter, and there are tons of Taylor craft lift struts laying around that you can get the 6 feet of material that you need, and it's going nowhere else. It's going nowhere else. So I've bought sets of Taylor craft lift struts that are no longer airworthy for $25 for a set of 4. And that's enough material to make all the lift struts and the cabanes on your Pete pole project. And it's easy to weld stuff, and there was nothing wrong with the lift struts in the first place. But, you know, so, you know, if that would be my primary choice. There are guys who make wooden lift struts on Pete poles. My friend Gary has them on his airplane. He made them. They're great. One of the highest time Pete poles ever saw was Alan Wise's. Anybody ever seen Alan Wise's airplane in Florida over the years? Remember the silver one that had the Awuga horn on it and the C-85 and the
Conestoga brakes.
Yeah, and Conestoga brakes, and it had fenders on the tires.
Yeah.
Right. That Alan Wise was a B-24 pilot in World War II. He was one of the few pilots who attacked Palesti 3 times and lived. And he built that Pete pole, and he flew it 2,400 hours, and he gave it to the Sun and Fun Museum. You know, so he had wooden lift struts on that airplane, and if you look closely, the wood was just stabilizing a piece of 1/8-inch thick steel that ran the entire length up the strut. I've seen people do this stuff. The only thing and it works, right? If you know how to put bolts into wood, not everybody does, and but the most common thing that people say is, Jennies have wooden struts on them, so why can't I have a wooden strut on my Pete pole? Okay, what's the answer?
They do know how to make them.
This gentleman right here is doing the hand gesture to show me.
The struts are holding the wings apart.
Yes,
Not holding the fuselage.
yes. All the struts on a Jenny are in compression. They're all in compression. They're also all made out of ash, and they're a really very tough material, and they were made in an era where people knew this stuff. Do the Jennies need bolts in them? No, they're being squeezed between 2 sockets, right? So on your Pete pole, primarily you're flying around, and that's in tension, not in compression. And so those are 2 different structural worlds. And the primary difference between the structural worlds is you got to have end fittings on it anyway, and you're going to have bolts into the wood. And I trust bolts into the wood for propellers and lots of other stuff, but I'm suspicious about fittings. If you've ever seen, how many people have a wooden prop on your airplane that you fly? How often are you supposed to retorque it? 4 times a year at an utter minimum. You ever go out to retorque it and you're like, good God, I flew this last week and the bolts all just took half a turn. I think I'm going to vomit, right? You've had that experience, all right? Now you have people who have wooden lift struts on their Pete pole, and you say, oh, you retorqued your prop 4 times last year. And they're like, absolutely, safety first. How many times you retorque the bolts that are holding on your lift struts? And they're like, haven't looked at them in 10 years. I was like, shall we go put a wrench on it and find out how loosey-goosey they are? So you got to watch stuff where people apply like it worked on Jenny's, because it's not doing the same job. Next question. Anybody else? Okay. If you got Corvair questions, we'll take them over to the pavilion and we'll talk about them. I want to thank everybody for coming out here and tolerating my horrible speaking manner, including this gentleman right here, who I'm friends with, even though you fell asleep during my speech. and I want to commend everybody else who was tempted to fall asleep. This man does what he wants in life, and that's to be And all of you people who are like, I have to stay awake, right? Life's too short to worry about what I think, all right?
I'm going to say a word here.
Sure.
I'd like to thank you guys all coming. My name is Larry Clements. I'm president of the BPA here. And I'd like to thank you for all coming out and being part of this. It's really, really great to see y'all guys here. And whoever owns that blue and yellow fleet out there, we have room for you in the hangar over here. We have weather coming in, and if you would like that inside, we can do that for you. So, hey, thanks for coming out.
Thanks. Thanks for providing the space. All right. Have a nice evening. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like what you're seeing, please remember to subscribe.